Oops, there we go. Just need to erase this quickly. Okay, so this is chapter 1 in your book. So I would recommend that you read through this online if you like, or if you have the physical copy of it. And I'm just going to give you what I think are the most important concepts here for this quarter. And so chapter 1 just kind of gives you an overview of the study of biology. And one of these overviews deals with what are the properties of living organisms versus non-living organisms. So we can talk about biotic versus abiotic. So a lot of the terminology you'll see over and over again. And one of these is when you put an A in front of a word, which actually means without. So we can talk about sexual and asexual. So asexual would be without sex. So abiotic just means without life. So one of the big properties that we see in living organisms is the need to be able to maintain order. So we have the maintenance of a relatively stable internal environment. And this has a term. Does anybody know what that is called? Does anybody know the scientific term for maintaining a relatively stable internal environment? Like we maintain a relatively stable temperature, and even if it's off by like a couple of degrees, we could feel really sick, right? So if our temperature goes from 98.6 to 100, we feel it. So how, does anybody know the term for that? Homeostasis. Excellent. And this means homeo means same, stasis means state. So it's a little bit deceiving to think about homeostasis as being constant, because actually our internal environment does fluctuate quite a bit. So for example, when we talk about blood pressure, it's really important that when we're laying down, our blood pressure will change as compared to when we're standing up. Also really important that when we go to run or to climb a set of stairs, that our heart rate will actually increase in order to keep up with the demands of oxygen, that we need oxygen in order to produce energy. And so if you're a person and you're climbing a set of stairs and your heart rate doesn't increase, you're going to have to stop, right? So this is actually what we would refer to as a dynamic equilibrium. And a good example of this is heart rate. This is just one example. We also have, like, if we think about our blood, we have changes in pH. Our blood contains glucose. We have changes in the amount of glucose that is in our blood when we first eat versus after fasting for a couple hours. And so the dynamic part is that it changes. The equilibrium is that it generally needs to stay within a given range, right? You would feel really bad if your heart rate goes up to 200 beats per minute. That would not make you feel good. You would feel like you're having a panic attack and you're dying and you'd end up in the hospital, right? And so we want there to be a range at which your body can maintain, right? So that's one of the characteristics. The second characteristic is that you must obtain energy and nutrients from the environment. So we're going to talk primarily about animals, unless we're talking about the ecology of the animal. But even plants have to obtain energy, but they get the majority of their energy from the sunlight, right? The nutrients that plants take in include carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So in order for a plant to grow from a seedling to a big bushy plant, it actually gets nutrients from the air. So it gets carbon dioxide from the air, and it builds tissue, builds organic molecules from that carbon dioxide. So one of the things about energy and nutrients and the exchange is that something interesting happens when we go from one form of energy to another. So when you transform one type of energy into another, energy is lost in the form of heat. And this actually happens even outside of a living system. So this is actually a law, a thermodynamic law that relates to physics that you might study in physics. But when we talk about energy, we could talk about chemical energy, for example. Right? So I have to obtain chemical energy from my environment in order to live. That energy is useful in maintaining homeostasis. It also maintains my internal order, right? So it helps to keep my body from breaking down. But I also need chemical energy for movement. So when we convert chemical energy to mechanical energy, one of the things that is lost to the environment is heat. So this is why when you exercise, you get hot. And we actually have to dissipate heat. One of the things that we do is we sweat. And that is a really efficient way of getting rid of heat through evaporative cooling. If you think about how awkward or unpleasant it would be to be like a dog, dogs do not sweat, right? How do dogs eliminate their heat? Pant, right? So if you can imagine, whenever we got hot, we had to pant in order to dissipate the heat. That would be kind of weird, right? Interestingly, some other organisms, some other mammals have different mechanisms for getting rid of this heat. So like one of my favorite examples are kangaroos. And so they have hairless patches of skin on their wrists, and they actually lick them. So they don't have any sweat glands, but they lick their wrists, and they kind of like hold them out like this, and that allows for evaporative cooling. You might have done something similar if you've gotten really hot outside. You go into the sink, right, and you run cold water over your wrists, and that will help to cool you down quickly. So that is just kind of a property of life. It says that we are releasing heat. But the other interesting thing that is a byproduct of this is that when we look at ecosystems, we tend to see that the energy in an ecosystem is the greatest at its base. And then as we move up the food chain or the food web, the amount of energy that is available is less because of this process of losing heat. So this is the basis for ecological pyramids. We'll put energy pyramids. So at the base of any ecosystem, we have the producers. Why are they called producers? What's an example of a producer in our ecosystem? Plants, right? So plants are able to produce biomass. This is the amount of energy in organic matter. So this would be like chemical energy. And they're able to produce organic molecules just using carbon dioxide and light, right? So they're considered to be the producers. So in a terrestrial ecosystem, these would be like plants. In an aquatic ecosystem, this would be algae, for example. Okay. And then as we move up in this ecological pyramid, and I'm actually not drawing this to scale, energy is lost. So this is the amount of biomass, amount of chemical energy. And so this would be like a herbivore. This is a carnivore. Okay. And then you might have organisms feeding upon the carnivores. So a good example of this, if we look at a kind of an interesting aquatic example in the ocean, we have algae. And then we have organisms that are called zooplankton. What's an example of zooplankton? Does anybody know? There are these tiny, tiny animals that float in the ocean, and they float in currents. And some organisms, some larger mammals, for example, will go there, like whales, and they'll feed upon the upwelling of the cold water that is full of zooplankton. Does anybody know, what is it that whales feed upon?
Krill.
Krill, excellent. Okay. So krill are actually like little shrimps. Okay, so that's just an example of zooplankton. Okay. Then we can have small fish. So let's put like sardines. And then let's put tuna. And then let's put humans / dolphins at the top. So in each layer, only about 10% of the energy gets transferred, which means that this amount should be 10% of this. So I kind of drew it bigger than it would normally be. And so you're losing energy at each level. And so this is what we talk about when we say we eat at the top of the food chain. And one problem with this is that there's not a lot of energy. If we're only going to eat large tuna, right, there's not a lot of energy available to that for us as humans. And we have to actually compete with dolphins. And in the past, what we did is that we would follow a dolphin pod around, and then the people that fish would put a net out into the ocean, and then they would, the dolphins know where the tuna are. So we actually kind of cheat. We would follow the dolphins, see where the tuna are, and then we put the nets out, and then we would catch the dolphins too. But we don't eat dolphins, right? So we have probably a bias against eating that high up on the food chain. Be kind of like eating a wolf, right? So we would compete for tunas, and that's why they say on the cans when you go to the grocery store, it says dolphin safe tuna. That means they didn't fish with the dolphins, so they weren't catching dolphins as a bycatch and then just throwing them back into the water dead. So this is sometimes what they say when we talk about how humans need to be lower on the food chain because our population has become so big. 7.5 billion people. Perhaps we need to eat lower on the food chain. And you could talk about cows here versus plants. And so in the terrestrial, generally it's a smaller food chain. Are there any questions about this idea? About energy moving, and one of the characteristics is that in living things, we lose energy as it is transformed from one organism or one group of organisms to the next. So why do we need this energy? We need energy to grow, to develop, and to reproduce. Right? So that's another characteristic of living things. They tend to grow, they tend to develop, and then they tend to reproduce. So when we talk about animals, they primarily reproduce sexually, And we'll talk about reproduction at the very end. But one of the interesting things about that is that sexual reproduction is actually a lot more difficult than asexual, than to just produce a clone. And so there has to be a big benefit to sexual reproduction. There has to be some big benefit as to why almost all organisms reproduce sexually rather than just simply producing clones of themselves. The other characteristic of living things is that they will change over time. So I'll just put populations change over time. And this is the big idea, that there is unity and diversity within organisms. So we believe that all organisms came from a common ancestor, and that is why they all use the same genetic code. All organisms are composed of cells that arose a long time ago and that then reproduced and produced into multicellular organisms. So, for example, we went to unicellular, which means one cell. And these gave rise to multicellular animals and plants. We take advantage of the fact that animals and plants have similar cellular machinery, and they use the same genetic code. So I could take a gene from a plant and I could put it into an animal, right? Or I could take a gene from an animal and I could put it into a plant, and then the cells will be able to read the genetic code because the genetic code is universal. And so that's one of the signs of evidence that we all evolved from a common ancestor. Okay, so in your textbook, they talk about how energy flows through the ecosystem, and energy at each level is lost as heat. Here would be the producers using sunlight, the ants that are harvesting that, and the ants actually use these leafcutter ants actually use the leaves to grow fungi. And then the fungi, they eat upon the fungi, they're like farmers, and then the fungi die, the plant material is recycled, and then we get inorganic nutrients that can be taken back up by the producers. There's also in your book the idea of that ecological pyramid, right? Where we have these top consumers, and they are in general much smaller in population size than the lower levels, right? So when we look at eagles, eagles are never going to be as abundant as snakes, right? Or never as abundant as deer, simply because they are higher up and there's less energy available to them. Okay, so we also have what we call the hierarchy of biological order. And this goes from small to big. And so when we look at this hierarchy, we can start talking about molecules. In Biology 101, we talk a lot about atoms, and we talk about how atoms come together to form molecules, but we'll just start with molecules here. And these would be like proteins. They would be like carbohydrates and lipids. Okay. These are all non-living. So enzymes are not alive, they're active. Enzymes are generally proteins. So molecules make up other things, right? They make up rocks that are non-living. They make up soil, which is non-living. So from this point, from the molecular standpoint, we then go to a higher level, which is the cell. Okay. This is living. Okay. So it has all of the characteristics that I just told you about. So if you took a blood cell or a liver cell or a muscle cell from your body, it would have generally those characteristics. Then from cells, we go to tissues. And so we could talk about cells that have a very similar structure and a very similar function. So we could talk about muscle tissue. We could talk about epithelial tissue like your skin. And then the next level is the organ level. Then we have system. Then we have individual. Population, community, and ecosystem. So one of the things that we find is that as we move to these higher levels, we have new properties emerging. And so we call these emergent properties. Okay, so as you move to a higher level, properties emerge that cannot be explained by the individual components. Oops. Okay. So this is one of the problems with studying complexity, right? So we are really good in Western science at reducing things down to the smallest level. So like when we're studying the brain, we might look at individual neurons and look at how they function. Right? But when you start to move up and we start to talk about the brain as an organ, it has properties that cannot be explained solely by looking at individual neurons. So the property of like conscious thoughts. Right? That's something that cannot be explained by just looking at an individual neuron or even at how neurons are put together in nervous tissue. So it's really, as we move up, we get these emergent properties and it becomes more complex. So it is harder to study from a biological perspective. And so when we move to population, community, and ecosystem, this is the study of ecology. And it becomes very complex because you have a lot of interconnectedness between the systems and a lot of things that we don't quite understand, right? So when we talk about climate change, for example, at the ecosystem level, we're like, why don't we understand that? We understand how individual neurons communicate with one another. How come we don't understand how the ecosystem works? And that's because it takes a little bit different way of thinking. And we have to be able to recognize these emergent properties. Okay? And actually, ecology is in its infancy as a science, kind of established in the 1970s. Right? Ecology, that's not that long ago. Right? Obviously, indigenous people have been studying their environment for a long period of time. And so they might have some insights into their ecosystem that we don't. Okay. So I'm just going to give you an example of this. Complex system, and it is about the rainforest and the climate. So let me get a minute. Forgot to cue this one. I can't actually remember if I showed this one.
In public, you know the feeling.
Okay.
A tropical rainforest without rain.
We didn't want to watch that commercial. Okay.
A tropical rainforest without rain wouldn't be much of a rainforest. I mean, all plants need water to grow, and without it, they shrivel up and die. So what about the ancient Hawaiian proverb, Hahai no ka ua ika ulula au, which means the rain follows after the forest? How could that be? Well, all land plants lose water when the pores on their leaves open up during photosynthesis, and this evaporation draws more water up through their stems. With so much rain soaking the soil in rainforests, water is nearly unlimited, and accordingly, rainforest trees can afford to move and lose more water than other plants. All that water vapor rising from the forest feeds moisture-laden clouds while also causing convection. Together, these effects accelerate the formation of rain, which falls to the soil and gets taken up all over again. This cycle of absorption, evaporation, and rain happens everywhere there are plants. However, super wet soil, fast pumping trees, and hot tropical sun make the cycle so fast in the rainforest that unlike other biomes where clouds might form in one place and rain in another, in a rainforest, all of that water stays in the same region. Without the forest pumping so much water into the air, rainforests wouldn't be as rainy. And without so much rain, the forest couldn't pump so much water into the air. So which came first, the rain or the rainforest? Well, before rainforests, ancestors of trees like cypress, pine, and spruce dominated the land, but they were conservative when it came to using and losing water, so the air tended to be dry, meaning less rain. However, around 130 million years ago, a new kind of plant developed that took the risk of losing more water in return for souped-up photosynthesis. These were the flowering plants, and their risk paid off. Their faster growth enabled them to outcompete the ancestral pines and take over the tropical regions of the globe. These angiosperms lost so much water into the air that as they spread, they brought their own rain with them. And today, tropical rainforests receive more rain than if they were pine forests. In some places, as much as a meter more rain each year. That's equivalent to an extra 2.5 hours of heavy rain each week. Not surprisingly, all that water cools off the forest too, which is why the Amazon isn't nearly as hot as the Sahara or even an East Texas pine forest in summer. But the hot, dry tropics of the past may soon be a part of our future. In parts of the Amazon where vast swaths of rainforest have been logged or cleared for agriculture, unusual droughts are already occurring, and forest fires have become more frequent. Scientists worry that these changes will lead to ever hotter, drier, and more flammable tropics in the coming decades, making things tougher both for the remaining forest and for the people who live there. So when in drought, plant a tree. Seriously, hahai no ka ua I ka ulula au. This episode of Minute Earth is supported in part by Cookie Blast, one of our subscribers on Sellable.
Okay, so that was a good example of complexity at the ecosystem level and an emergent property, rain, right? So the rain cannot be explained unless you actually look at the trees. And so if you've ever been to like Hawaii or to the Caribbean, one of the really interesting things is it'll be like completely clear in the morning. It'll be nice and sunny. It'll be like, oh, today looks like it's going to be really nice. It's not windy. It's completely clear. And then by afternoon, it gets cloudy. And then like by the middle of the afternoon, it just pours rain, right? And that's because the clouds are just forming right over your head as the trees lose water to the atmosphere. So that would be an example of kind of looking at the complexity of a system, a holistic system. Okay, so I'm going to skip over that part because we already talked about that. Okay, so we're going to be talking about the diversity of animals. And so I need to introduce you to the idea of evolution. And we're going to talk specifically about macroevolution. So macroevolution versus microevolution. So microevolution is when populations change. So they evolve resistance. So for example, we can see microevolution in a petri dish where a population of bacteria will become resistant to antibiotics, which means that they have changed such that the antibiotics do not inhibit their growth anymore, right? So they can just grow. The difference between micro and macro is that the macroevolution is the evolution of new groups. So this would be the evolution of new species or major groups. Okay. Microevolution, on the other hand, is just a change in a population. Like antibiotic resistance. In bacteria. So when we talk about macroevolution, we can look at the fossil history of vertebrates, for example. So this would be looking at the fossil record of vertebrates. So this is my example. So when we look at the fossils, these are remnants of animals that died, and then their bones or their feathers or whatever becomes mineralized. So it actually becomes rock, right? So when we look at fossils, one of the things that we find in the rocks is that we have at the top newer in general, newer rock. And then as we move down, we have older rock. So when we go back and we excavate down through rocks, sometimes we get to the point where there's only one type of vertebrate present. So in the oldest rocks, we see that there are only fish. Right? So fish came first in the terms of vertebrates. These are organisms with backbones. Then we see amphibians in newer layers of rocks. So amphibians specifically are tetrapods, so they have 4 limbs, and they moved on to land, right? However, they were still tied to land because they have to go back to water to reproduce. So we're talking about like frogs and salamanders. And then we see reptiles. And then interestingly, the reptiles gave rise to birds and mammals. So we only find birds and mammals, specifically mammals, in newer rock formations. We do not see them way back in the fossil record. Interestingly, they've actually decided that birds are examples of reptiles. They used to be a separate group. Now they consider them reptiles, and they kind of call them living dinosaurs because they're related to the dinosaurs. Okay? So this progression would be an example of macroevolution. We also see macroevolution at a smaller scale. So this is an example of finches that I found on the Galapagos. And this is actually not from your book, it's from a different book. But the common ancestor, we now see that is believed to have given rise to all of the variety of finches that we find on the Galapagos Islands. And that was due to them becoming isolated and then competing for access to different types of food. So we have the big-billed, those could be finches that specifically feed upon nuts, and the smaller bills up there at the top are Galapagos finches that feed on insects. And so this would be an example of macroevolution because it is speciation. So it's a bigger group than just a population. These are different species because they are unable to reproduce and produce fertile offspring. Okay, so the last thing we're going to talk about are mechanisms of macroevolution. So how do we get macroevolution occurring? And the first one is that we can have modification of already existing structures. So the best example, and the one that's probably most often used, is the forelimb, so the arm of vertebrates. Okay. So when we look at that forelimb and we look at how it is arranged, you have one big bone, your humerus, and then you have 2 bones, which are the radius and the ulna. And then you have a bunch of little bones in your wrist, which are the carpal bones. then you have the metacarpals, and then you have the fingers, right? So we could compare, say, for example, a human arm versus a bat wing, right? So the wing in bats is a modification of the forearm. The wing also in birds is also a modification of the forearm. So when we look at the bat wing, we can see all of the bones, the same bones that make up the human arm. Okay. So we've just modified the rate at which those bones grow, and the shape of them is modified. So if we look at a diagram here, this would be the human, those bones I just mentioned. This would be the bat. It's got a humerus, radius, and ulna. It's got the carpal bones. It's got the metacarpal bones, and then it has the finger bones that make up the bat wing. So if they have the same embryonic origin, they're said to be homologous. So homologous structures are the same evolutionary origin, sorry, same evolutionary origin. Homo means same, okay? Analogous is important to, so this would be versus analogous. So this is the same function, but it has a different origin. So if we looked at a bat wing versus a butterfly wing, butterflies did not modify their walking legs. Butterflies still have 6 walking legs. And so their wings are derived from the exoskeleton, and it's kind of an outgrowth of the exoskeleton on the back of their body. So this would be, example would be a bat wing and a butterfly wing. They would be analogous because they're both used for flight, but they are not homologous. They have a different evolutionary origin. One way that things change is through differences in growth, and this is the last thing we'll talk about here. So this is an example of a chimpanzee infant skull and a chimpanzee adult versus humans. So if we look at the skull bones, during their young years, so if you look at that chimpanzee, the skull bone between the chimpanzee fetus and the human fetus is almost identical. Right? They have the same bones. But the rate at which the bones grow is different. And so here we can see that in the chimpanzee, the jaw gets really big, right? The mandible and the maxilla gets really big compared to their kind of squishes their skull, as compared to humans, which kind of retain, right, the more not primitive, the more juvenile characteristic. So humans, we are said to be kind of juvenile-like as primates because our skull is very similar to a young human skull, right, or a fetus skull. Does that make sense to everybody? So this would be a modification of an already existing structure. Okay, so this actually goes back to my second one, So this is mechanisms of macroevolution. So this would be retention of juvenile characteristics. Oops, not retention, retention of juvenile characteristics. And this has a name. This is called, actually has 2 names. It can be called paedomorphosis, or it can be called neoteny. So paedo means ancient form or old form, and neo kind of means new. Right? So these are the retention of a juvenile characteristic. So the example that I just gave would be the human skull, because we retain the juvenile proportions of our skull. But another good example of this is the retention of gills in some amphibians. So I'm going to use example. Retention of gills in some amphibians. Okay. So most amphibians, when you look at frogs, for example, they go from a tadpole to an adult, and they undergo metamorphosis. And the tadpole form has a tail, right? And it has gills. And so this is their aquatic form. And then the adult, it loses its tail. It actually absorbs it, the tail, so the tail goes away, and it loses its gills, and it develops a lung. It also, most frogs also use their skin for respiration to get oxygen. But this would be the normal, but when we look at newts, right, the adults remain aquatic with gills and a tail. Okay. So newts evolved, right? They just retained the tadpole characteristics. So they don't leave the water. They stay in the water. So if we look at an example of a newt, so this is an adult, and the reason why I know it's an adult is because this one can reproduce. So that's kind of how we define adults. So even at this stage, even though they look very much like a tadpole, they would be able to reproduce. And this is that famous one that's called, I can't even pronounce it, but it's in Mexico. That's a Zoctol or something like that, that is endangered, this particular example of it. Okay, so I will stop there for today, and I will see you at 2 o'clock for lab downstairs in ST 115. And let me know if you have any questions.